the systems that we rely on are no longer serving us. And so we have to stop thinking that they're acting in our best interest.
1.7% of Canadians are still listening to the dinosaur CBC. Wow. And yet, everybody's being taxed to finance this glut.
Any silence or any compliance allows the tyranny to continue.
It's a bit like the Westminster system of government, the WHO. You have to get out of it and you have to get it out of you.
At last count, we had 10 times the rate of MAID as California. And California's no shining star either.
30-40% of the dead bodies in Pennsylvania have those white rubbery things that didn't exist filling people's arteries until the safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine.
We're in an abusive relationship with our governments, and we have to end this abusive relationship.
Centralized, expanded governments collapse into corruption. And what we need to build is local governments. And local governance really starts with governing your own self, governing your own mind.
Welcome, friends. Nice to have you back with us again for Wins of the Week. My good friend Dr. Mark Trozzi is here. We're into the second day of spring, Mark. I can feel the budding of spring coming. It's a nice time of year.
Yeah, all the creatures are Twitter baiting, as was said in the movie Bambi. We're just getting that energy, love, exercise, everything's a little more alive. So it's a great time to be alive. Again, happens every year. I love it.
Well, and I think that we're coming into a spring of the changes that we need to see in the world. Canada's still lagging behind other places, but as we go through the winds, there's a sea change, I would say. There's some recognition that the last 5 years was in the wrong direction, and I think we've got reasons to be hopeful that things can be turned around, that, the Titanic might not sink after all, but we still have lots of work to do, don't we, Mark?
Yeah, we do. And Ted, it's sometimes, Canadians, we need a little special encouragement, because as you said, well, things aren't going that great in Canada, but they're going better in some other places. And I think if we think of it a little bit like fixing the tires on a car, if you go around, you're like, hey, this tire can be patched. Let's pull it off and patch it. Oh yeah, this tire we can work with. We just got to straighten the dents in the rim. This one's totally shot. We got to rip it off and chuck it and put a new one on. That's where we are. And that's just that's just where the process has to be. That's just the reality of eyes wide open. So I think that, being embraced in that moment of realization of complete illegitimacy, which is certainly where I am, out of all these old world institutions. And that's part of the success story north of the 49th. And who knows, maybe, the Republic of Ontario will remember these days, at how it sparked on the revolution and we became part of some meaningful union of free states or something like that. So I remain optimistic too, Ted.
Well, I'm not willing to give up. I have to share with you a little exchange I had with my wife yesterday, Mark, is that I said to her, "Thank you for indulging me in my fantasy that I can change the world."
Oh, Ted, it's not going to be the song of the day, but do you remember the song? I told her someday if she was my girl, I could change the world with my little songs. So, you know what, Ted? I think you are changing the world. And, every individual is a world unto themselves, and you have changed so many people's lives. You have saved many lives. There are many children that are functional, don't have autism, et cetera, because of you. Right now, there are pregnant women in all across this country and around the world reading a little book called The New Parent's Guide and making some smart choices. So you are changing the world, Ted.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. That's all my grandchild's parents' coffee table, you can be sure.
Well, we have to get them sooner than later. I don't know whether you've seen the book that was put out this week by Unbecoming. He has a Substack then. He's prolific in his writing, but he put out a book this week about the vitamin K shot. And the short version of the story, Mark, is he said this has got nothing to do with health. This is about teaching compliance. And there's a line in there that he says, before the child has a name, they have an injection in their thigh. And we have to ask why. And it's a pretty rude realization that the whole vitamin K narrative is about getting parents used to having their babies injected. And I thought it was brilliant. I wrote about it in our newsletter for Vaccine Choice Canada this week.
Oh, Ted, thanks for doing that. Well, I definitely want to look into that because, as you know, Ted, I've been asked at times to give opinions on things, and I've been asked to give an opinion on that. In fact, you were part of the group, and I'd done some research, and I honestly had to say, well, I feel my opinion at this point is limited. I need to do more research. So let's share the link for that
Mhm.
article on unbecoming. Yeah, we'll share the link for that, folks, so you can get ahead of me on the next steps in researching vitamin K in kids. Ted, before we jump in, and I'd love to look at some of the comments from last week as well, but we were in a meeting earlier, and it was, a meeting of a pretty large group of people who've all taken a leadership position, as in ready, willing, and able, and putting their mind and their hands to the tasks that the last 5 years especially have made people aware of that we need to be very diligent if there's going to be a future. And anyways, in that meeting, you discussed priorities, and you'd been looking at many people's suggestion on what they thought the priorities were. And our good friend Vince Gersey had sort of set out the idea, let's figure out what our priorities are. But in the context of that conversation, Ted, you sort of just shared from your own thoughts. You said, these are what I think are priorities. And our audience on Wins of the Week, I have faith, are a lot of the freedom leaders where they
Mhm.
live. And so I just thought that was a conversation. That was something I'd love you to share with the Wins of the Week crowd, if you would, about, you know, given where we are, our different levels of enlightenment and exhaustion,
Mhm.
what should we do now? What's sort of some of our core philosophical ideas to carry us forward?
Yeah, Mark, it came out of that challenge of Vincent Gersey's about a month ago to say, what are our priorities in this freedom movement? Can we identify the top three? And I invited people in the group in the meeting that I host every Friday to share with me their thoughts of what they see as the priority. And it was a challenge because there are so many areas that were being attacked on. And I said, I've come to the realization we're in an abusive relationship with our governments, and we have to end this abusive relationships. But if you list every area where we're being attacked and harmed, it's like 30, 40, 50, and every one of them is valid. It's a worthwhile battle to be in. And my challenge is that I don't think there's a top three of those. But what I did come to the realization is that there's a couple things that I think we have to recognize. One is that I said I want people to follow their passion. So if there's an area that you're committed to, don't feel like you have to do somebody else's battle. Do the battle that you're committed to. And for me, it's, vaccine risk awareness, it's protecting informed consent. So that was the first thought that I shared with the group. Second was that I think that the next priority needs to be to take good care of oneself. We have to be in a community that's supportive. We have to do the best we can to make ourselves independent and resilient. We have to stop depending on the structures of society. And so, whatever that looks like, whether that's stockpiling food, whether it's growing some vegetables, whether it's having some chickens in your backyard, whether it's developing, alternatives to our digital currency system, use money, invest in silver and gold and those kinds of things. But I think the bottom line is we have to realize that the systems that we rely on are no longer serving us. And so we have to stop thinking that they're acting in our best interest. I don't think they are. And then, the third one is that I was suggesting that I've learned that there are two kinds of energies. There's reactive energy and there's creative energy. And the bad guys want to keep us in a state of reactivity. And one of the primary tools to do that is fear. And so they evoke fear and we react to what they're doing to us. But that keeps us locked into a reactive state of mind. We're all, kind of cleaning up the mess of what they've created. The other energy is creative, and I believe that we're creative beings. The line out of the Bible that says that we're created in the image and likeness of God, I believe that that's true. And it doesn't mean that we look like God. It means that we can create like God, that we too are creators. And so I know that in my life, I've very intentionally at various times have stopped and said, what do I want to create? What does it look like? And I've done things like create a vision board where I will take magazines and clip up pictures and words and images, and I will assemble them on bristle board and I hang that in my room and I remind myself every day about what my intentions are. And I've been surprised and delighted how many of those images that I put on that vision board have come true. So I have had some spectacular examples of that. That you know that there's more to this world than the third dimension. That there's other energies and levels of consciousness that are at play here. So I was simply inviting the audience this morning to say I think we need to spend some time very consciously and very intentionally articulating what we want to create. What does it look like? And I've learned that in order to create something, that there are two questions that you have to ask. The first one is a what question. What does it look like? What is it that you want? You have to be able to articulate that. And then the second question is, how do we do that? So a what question and then a how question. So that was just kind of a high level overview of what I was inviting the group this morning to consider.
Well, Ted, thanks for sharing that. I have to admit, I really take that to heart myself, Ted. Like the idea of the vision board, of doing things that maybe we're sort of putting jumper cables on the universe a little bit when we do things like that. Where we put in front of ourselves visions. You think even of our great authors. I mean, Jules Verne drew pictures and wrote the idea of rockets, and over the next century, mankind made it happen. You could look at it that way. And I particularly find it challenging on the subject of, not being reactive. And the trick for me personally in that is 30 years as an emergency doctor. A good emergency doctor doesn't go into work and plan what they're going to do that day. So like today, I'd really love to do one leg fracture and I'd love to deliver a baby. You have to react to what comes in. Whatever is coming up comes in. And I applied that to the situation when the COVID operation was launched against mankind, which was for me, like you, the biggest medical emergency going, and therefore took my attention since then. And again, in my own little bubble, reminds me of something else you were just saying, which is that balance of taking care of our health too, because one can really burn out in that way, and even biomedically. And about 3.5 years into this, Dr. Becker in Austria at a convention hooked me up on a machine that evaluates all sorts of things and said, "You're going to die if you don't stop. You've just exhausted every system in your body. And if one keeps going, how are you going to do anything?" So I think it's a really tricky thing to find that balance, and a bit like horses too. There's some horses that they want to run and you have to almost coach them into going a little light. And there's some horses that you got to whip them in the butt to go at all. And so I guess you got to know what kind of person you are and how you have to motivate yourself or prevent yourself from killing yourself. But however you're doing it, we're glad you are. Ted, we had some great comments as usual. And actually, friends, forgive me, last week was kind of a very busy week. And so I got to read all the comments right away and like them. And I thought about, things I wanted to write back. And the week just carried away with me. So I got to enjoy your comments more than enter into the conversation. But there's so much there. And I'm just going to take a few extracts out. And by no means does this take away from some of the very good detailed content, but just a few playful things from last week's. We talked about how in the US now, medical school to become one of the great high priests of health, to become a medical doctor, is now going to involve 40 hours of nutrition because it only involved 2 hours before. So we're happy about that. But I got Linnell McDonald wrote, I had a laugh. I had a great laugh about the 40 hours of work required regarding food and nutrition because I think 10,000 hours is too little. So let's hope 40 hours is just the start. And we encourage all you young medical students out there, learn a lot about nutrition because Hippocrates was right. Let your food be your medicine and medicine be your food. This was a very encouraging comment from Ohm, who said, there are 3 events that have changed my life and for which I'm very grateful. The trucker convoy, the National Citizen Inquiry, and Vaccine Choice Canada. And then she also added, wins of the week is the icing on the cake. The truth empowers us. Thank you. And thank you, Linnell. And this one is fun. This is from your own hometown there in Kelowna. Linda Taylor wrote, thanks for reading Charlie Chaplin's speech. I've been following you and Ted for years, and it keeps me tuned into the truth you're both weaving into your lives. Last summer, I went to see you in Kelowna, and I was immediately reminded of Charlie Chaplin when you walked up to the stage. I must have been walking a little fast and funny. She said, "This was a definite impression I couldn't shake off. I just thought to mention it to you as it is funny." And then she said, he championed, summarized where you dared to go on a regular basis.
Mm,
Thanks for your courage, commitment, and keeping the light shining on our pathways to freedom.
mm.
Ted, is Charlie Chaplin handsome?
He's a very handsome guy.
I thought so. I thought so. Well, thank you, Linda.
Yeah,
I'm honored.
that's a nice message. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's so many great comments. Actually, I had a comment on a post where I interviewed Jody Ledgerwood this week about the Adam Skelly hearings. Rick Zamuto wrote something there. It's quite detailed, but it had me falling out of my chair. So, folks, if you feel like a great Rick Zamuto quote, we'll link to it in today's printed material. But have a look at the post about Adam Skelly from a few days ago and scroll down and have a look at what Rick wrote. Well, Ted, once again, I mean, it is time to celebrate the wins of the week. And there's a bunch of wins, once again, worth celebrating. So, shall we start with the political wins?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw a bone to Alberta here. Alberta is taking a stand against the worrying expansion of assisted suicide across Canada, tabling new legislation to stop the practice from being used on minors, people with mental health issues as their sole underlying condition, and those whose deaths are not foreseeable. The proposed, it's called Safeguards for Last Resort Termination of Life Act, intends to ensure that assisted suicide is not utilized as a substitute for adequate care and support for mental health or disabilities. If passed, the legislation would explicitly prohibit assisted suicide, also referred to as medical assistance in dying, when mental illness is the sole underlying condition for the request. Those struggling with severe mental health challenges need treatment, compassion, and support, not a path to end their life at what may be their lowest moment. In Alberta, a patient whose sole underlying condition is mental illness will not be eligible for MAID. I guess well done, Danielle Smith and the
Yeah.
Alberta UPC. Ted, what are your thoughts on this? It looks like dialing back the killing of people by the government.
Oh, I'm delighted to see this. I think Canada, I mean, if you look globally, Canada is by far the most extreme in its use of medically assisted in dying. I think I read somewhere that this week that it passed 100,000 deaths from MAID. I also saw an article. It told the story of an 84-year-old woman in Vancouver who woke up with some stomach pain and she was taken to the emergency Vancouver General Hospital. And according to this woman's story, she says the first words out of the doctor's mouth was, "Would you like us to give you MAID?" And she said, "No, I want you to see what's wrong with me and fix me up." It's like, it's disturbing how MAID is being introduced, and it's completely out of proportion to how the rest of the world is engaging this new medical practice. Canada has approximately the same population as California, and I think at last count we had 10 times the rate of MAID as California. And California's no shining star either, so that's rather disconcerting. So I'm delighted to see a little bit of brakes being put on. I think we need a whole lot more brakes than currently exists.
Yeah, I think it's a step in the right direction, which is getting back off the edge of the cliff. And, I'm glad that they're specifically mentioning like people who are suicidal, people who have, everybody has, if you haven't had a mental health issue in your life, you haven't been here. You must have missed the show. If you haven't had depression, anxiety, reactive depression, it's life is a psychological journey. And it used to be, and it still should be, and it still will be the places where I will be teaching medical schools, that when someone's suicidal, it is a medical emergency, not to help them die,
Right.
but to address that is how severe their thing has come. Now, not if they're just, some people just threaten suicide. It's just a manipulative tool. You know that, Ted. Person who takes one aspirin, lays in the ground and says, "Oh, you got to come back to me even though I was a terrible partner," or whatever. I mean, there's crazy stuff that goes on there. But in general, suicide isn't a sign that someone needs to die. It's a sign that somebody has severe mental health issues and needs help.
Yeah. It's a
And
call for help. Yeah.
yeah, and the reason there were rules, if someone was certifiably suicidal, as an emergency doctor myself, if I met somebody and I'm compassionate and I care, And they say, yeah, I just want to kill myself, doc. That's how I feel. I say, I'm glad you came because we got to prevent you from doing that and help you get better. And we had a report just recently of young people, a young family, and they brought like the 18-year-old brother to the emergency department because he was depressed and suicidal. And they got a phone call a few days later that he was dead because he took MAID. I mean, that's complete upside down. And so, Alberta, thanks for taking a small step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of countries that have taken a big step in the right direction, what's coming out of Argentina, Ted?
Well, apparently this week Argentina formally completed its withdrawal from the World Health Organization, making it the second major nation in the last couple of months to sever ties with the WHO. This was announced by their foreign affairs minister, who confirmed that Argentina exited on March the 17th, exactly 1 year after Argentina filed its formal notice. It says Argentina will now pursue health cooperation through bilateral agreements and regional forums, safeguarding its sovereignty and its capacity to make decisions regarding health policies. I'm delighted to see this. It says that there is a way of exiting the WHO, and kudos to Argentina for being a leader in doing that.
Yeah, Argentina has been ahead of the curve, and it just goes to show. I mean, because people think a lot of times of Argentina as a super oppressive regime. Terrible things happened in Argentina some decades ago, but things have really changed there. Just like Canada used to be a free country with free speech, and now Canada leads the way in killing their own
Yeah.
citizens and locking people up for what they think. This issue of exiting the WHO is so important, but I think there's a caveat, and I want to make sure I put a link. And actually, you and I were in a meeting a couple weeks ago, Ted, with Lucinda out of Australia looking at this issue, which is, and I'm curious what Argentina's situation is, but the United States situation, for instance, the United States has exited the WHO, but there's 70 plus
Right.
WHO collaboration centers all throughout the US. So it's interesting. It's a bit like the Westminster system of government, the WHO. You have to get out of it and you have to get it out of you. So this is a great step in the right direction. And, lots of respect to Argentina, Dr. Hector Carvalho and the president there and others who've led the way. Well, here's something out of the USA, U.S. Representative Chip Roy. Isn't that a nice name? Chip Roy. Sounds like a cool guy you want to go fishing with. Hey, Chip, throw me the bait there, Chip. Anyways, U.S. Representative Chip Roy has introduced the Let Injured Americans Be Legally Empowered Act, a bill that would strip COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers of the federal legal immunity granted during the pandemic and allow millions of injured Americans to pursue civil lawsuits. This liable act would remove all federal laws that grant COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers immunity from the civil liability for harms caused by the shots. It would also allow individuals to pursue lawsuits even if they previously filed claims through federal compensation programs, and the legislation would apply retroactively, meaning people vaccinated early in the pandemic could still bring legal action, or their loved ones of the deceased. If the bill becomes law, the legal reckoning would be enormous. A tsunami of lawsuits from millions of vaccine injured Americans would slam vaccine manufacturers such as Pfizer and Moderna, potentially large enough to drive the companies into bankruptcy for a
Mhm.
good start. Ted, this is long overdue. What are your
Oh,
thoughts on Chip's bill?
well, first of all, they never should have been granted legal immunity in the first place back in 1986. I think that was one of the probably the worst decision, both political and medical, in the last century. I imagine that I'm delighted to see this bill being proposed. I imagine we're going to see one heck of a fight by the vaccine industry, the vaccine cartel, for them to retain their legal immunity from lawsuits. But it'll be interesting because we're going to see who stands with the people that have been injured and who stands with an industry that, on one hand, says that our products are safe and effective, and on the other hand, insists on having legal immunity so that they don't get sued because their products aren't safe and effective. Now, if that doesn't wake up somebody, I don't know what it would take to wake them up.
Yeah. Yeah, Ted, this makes me think of our good friend Reiner Fuellmich.
Mm.
And, Reiner in 2020, when a handful of us sort of were beginning to follow what he was saying and what he was doing. So back in 2020, before the poison death shots were even out, he said, I predict, and of course, Reiner Fuellmich is probably the world champion of class action lawsuits. I mean, having taken down Deutsche Bank, Volkswagen, a major shipping industry as well. And he said, this will result in the by far largest class action lawsuits in the history of the world. Simple math, when you try to inject the entire population and abuse them
Yeah.
like that and lock them down, I mean, the whole thing was unlawful. And so I really pray for Chip Roy and for this Let Injured Americans Be Legally Empowered Liability Act to pass. And bankrupting these companies is just the start. And I hope we keep in mind there's got to be criminal charges too. And that way, Pfizer and Moderna can't turn into empty sacks as all the executives flee the ship and say, yeah, go ahead, sue the empty sack. There's nothing there. We took it all. No, this has got to follow every one of those guys back to their mansions and all those assets. There's your way to compensate these people. So watch out because the executives, Pfizer, Moderna, that's exactly what they're going to try to do. They're probably already working on it.
And one of the other reasons why this has to be implemented is right now, any compensation for vaccine injury doesn't come from the vaccine manufacturer, it comes from citizens. And to me, citizens shouldn't be paying for vaccine injury. It should be those that have produced an unsafe product and those that have injected it. They should also be liable for the injury and deaths that are caused. So the accountability has to sit on the shoulders of those that have created these products. And that's the only way that you can have any reasonable justice and accountability in the world today.
Yeah, there's got to be. I agree, Ted. Ted, this next item that you're going to share, I just want to give it a little preamble. Folks, do you remember Jacinda Ardern? Do you
Mm.
remember those scary movies? They were called like, Nightmare in New Zealand. So New Zealand was a lot like Canada. It was one of the like worst, most abusive places in the world during the early COVID operation, forced injections and everything. So it's a rare item. We have good news from New Zealand. Ted, what is happening in New Zealand?
Yeah, you reminded me of that, Jacinda. There, what sticks in my mind as soon as you mention her name is that when she would announce the lockdown measures and the forced vaccination, she would have this smile on her face, which just was so unbelievable that somebody could be that, I want to say evil. I don't know how else to describe it. Anyways, in a social media post this week, Winston Peters, who's the leader of New Zealand First Party, he wrote, today New Zealand has informed the Director General of the World Health Organization. It has officially rejected the proposed amendments as part of the pandemic treaty. He goes on to say, New Zealand First has always said that any decisions about the health of Kiwis should be made from Wellington, not Geneva. We have fought on your behalf for these IHR amendments to be fully rejected. We made a promise to put national interests of New Zealanders first, to maintain our sovereign decision making, and to push back on globalist bureaucrats, and we have kept that promise. Boy, wouldn't you like to hear those words out of a Canadian Prime Minister?
Oh boy, would you ever. I can imagine like some very good folks are like standing there with the gasoline and a torch at the base of the parliament in New Zealand and they get this news like, whoa, 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 stop, hold on, hold on. We get to keep it after all. It looks like legitimacy might return. So that's kind of nice to see.
Well, and there's an addendum here. So Peters also shared documentation this week from way back in December of 2021, which confirmed that the risk of the COVID injections to those under 18 years of age that were never made public. And then he went on to ask, when is the Labour Party, which is the party that was in power when they brought in all the lockdowns and vaccine mandates, when are they going to be held accountable? And boy, that's the question. When is our Liberal government in Canada going to be held accountable? When is the government in the United States going to be held accountable? Each government that participated in this tyranny needs to be held accountable.
Yeah. And Winston points out an interesting part, and I can't help but put my little science cap on here for a moment. The risk of the COVID injection for those under 18 years of age. So I don't have the particular New Zealand data in front of me, but we know what the UK data showed. The UK data showed that depending on the age group, some young age groups, like some child age groups, I think it was 10 to 14, there were age groups in which a person's risk of death increased 100 times.
Wow.
Like you literally could say, hey, your 11-year-old is 100 times more likely than normal 11-year-olds to be dead in a year if you take the shot. Put that in context. Nobody has a real excuse. The science was clear. COVID was not a dangerous disease for children. The risk of deaths was statistically zero, even with all these governments blocking the treatment and locking up people like Dr. Phillips for trying to do it. And then to boot, folks, the COVID shot makes you more likely to get COVID. So I think Winston Peters has got a bone well worth chewing on here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the kids didn't eat anything. They forced something on them, made them more likely to get COVID, and they didn't reveal the risks, which were dramatic and
Yeah.
predictable. So, hey, great things. Winston Peters, New Zealand first party. There's some people worth keeping our eye on.
Yeah. So there's reasons to be hopeful. There's change happening, and maybe Canada will get inspired by that change.
Yeah. Well, I think we are. I think the real people north of the 49th are.
Hmm.
It's just, there's the momentum of the old order. Well, that brings us into our medicine and health section of WIN, so we'll get to put our science hats on here a bit. Here's an interesting one. New research from the University of Albany shows a difference in how plants absorb various types of what are called forever chemicals, and I can go into that in a minute. So, how plants absorb various types of forever chemicals. By the way, forever chemicals is not a good thing. Okay. So they've noticed differences in how plants absorb various types of forever chemicals when farms spread sewage sludge, raising red flags for unregulated chemicals that could cross-contaminate crops like corn and lettuce. Sewage sludge is the end product of the wastewater treatment process that is occasionally used as fertilizer on farmland because it reduces costs for farmers. Advocates in New York have pushed to ban the practice over concerns of contamination in nearby drinking wells, and sewage sludge has been linked to human health issues such as increased risk of cancer, birth defects, other reproductive concerns, and that's according to the US EPA. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is currently in the process of implementing new regulations for biosolids as well. And the proposed regulations would not allow crops to be grown in those fields that have been spread with sewage sludge. Ted, before we jump in, I just want to, what are forever chemicals? So
Well,
forever chemicals refer to a group of substances. They can be referred to as polyfluoroalkyl substances but the bottom line is, and there's more than 10,000 of these out there. They are synthetic organic fluorine molecules. So when you think of organic chemistry, it involves carbons and hydrogens, like you see in the backbones of most of our molecules. But fluorine, when fluorine is bound to a carbon atom, that bond is very strong and very hard to break. And it makes these chemicals very hard to break down.
mm,
They're forever chemicals. They're resistant to hydrolysis, photolysis, microbial degradation. They endure for decades, maybe even millennium in the environment and bioaccumulate in organisms. Their half-life in a human being, when we get some of this into us, and believe me, we do have it in us, is often years. And they're linked to everything from liver problems, hormone reproductive disruption, kidney, testicular cancers, thyroid dysfunction. There's a lot of issues with forever chemicals. And here the University of Albany is diving into it. New York's looking at it.
mm.
Sorry, Ted, I really hung onto the mic on that one. I wanted to fill in some of the blanks, but
No, that's
what are
helpful.
your thoughts on sewage sludge in your garden?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that there's now attention being brought to this, and they're going to prevent sewage sludge from being spread on fields and then growing crops on it. My question is, based upon what you just said about how long it takes for these products to break down, they've already been spreading sewage sludge on our farmland for, I don't know, 10 years. This is not a new practice. And does that mean that all of those previous farmlands will no longer be allowed to be food crops grown on them? It should be pretty interesting, but it's rather alarming because they were spreading this stuff in the United States on the playgrounds of kids' schools, on parks, and once again, it's like where's the evidence to support that this is a safe practice? And it just seems like profit and financial considerations always supersede safety. And boy, it seems like we're slow learners.
Yeah. And Ted, I have to admit, I have some very somewhat mixed feelings or mixed thoughts on this because I think one of the flaws in society from a point of view of food and septic waste is that we eat the food, which has taken the minerals out of the soil, and then those minerals, they leave our body in our urine and in our feces, And those are actually the minerals that need to go back on the field after the correct processes, because otherwise you're draining the elements out of the system. So if we
Right.
constantly drain the minerals out of the field through our digestive tract into the lakes and rivers, we pollute the lakes and rivers, we render the fields infertile. And that's what's happened. The problem with just going sewage sludge is a lot of things end up in the sewer. I mean, people are changing their oil, pouring it down the drain. A lot of this, unfortunately, sewer sludge is not a well-controlled, good collection of healthy human waste. But for folks who are off grid, actually, it is a very intelligent thing to do, which is to capture your feces and urine, put them through. There's lots of variety of ways, including just proper composting, and render some of the most amazing fertile new soil to use in your gardening. So I'm really pro the idea, but the problem is sewage sludge is a big cocktail of a lot of things, including forever chemicals. And I think
Right.
I think that's an even bigger issue. We got to look at what do we do about these forever chemicals? We've got to stop adding them, even if we don't have a way to remove them yet. And I suspect Paul Stamets will show us how to remove them using mycelium in the end.
Well, that's good. That's helpful information to know that there's value to that practice, but it has to be done right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The last one we have here, Mark, is the Ontario government is ending financial support for 7 supervised drug consumption sites this June as the province shifts focus from harm reduction to treatment and abstinence. And Premier Doug Ford said in a March 16th social media post, drug injection sites are a failed experiment that make communities unsafe and trap vulnerable people in addiction. I'm surprised they allowed this in the first place, but Ford has called supervised drug consumption facilities the worst thing that could ever happen to a community. And boy, we certainly see that in British Columbia and in Vancouver in particular, is that these safe drug injection sites have become what I think just adds to the ease of addiction. There's no evidence that they've actually saved lives. A document was shared with me this week that I need to spend more time consuming, but it basically, Mark, you'll find this interesting. It provides a history of how Dr. Bonnie Henry, which is the chief medical officer in BC and the one who advocated for these safe injection sites, formed a company years beforehand that provides the drugs for these safe injection sites. So, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's how drug cartels work, right? Is you make sure that you control the market, you control you own the crack houses and you sell the crack. So I think it makes total sense. It's good business sense, but it's also evil. Forgive me, Ted. I got to go on a little rant here, folks. Premier Doug Ford, who's now saying drug injection sites failed experiment. I agree, Doug. I agree, and I'm glad to see you agree. But this makes me think of that old saying, a politician is somebody looking for a parade to get to the front of and make it look like they're leading it. This is no means leadership. And if by any chance, Doug, you're listening to this, God bless your brother and his passing. But would you consider having another serious look at cheesecakes? And by that, Doug, I mean this. When people like myself were sacrificing everything we owned to warn the public about a dangerous forced genetic toxic injection being misrepresented as a safe and effective vaccine, you were telling people to stay home and bake a cheesecake while we were also discovering that obesity is one of the big risk factors of COVID and is also one of the risk factors for dying faster from the injections. So if we're going to talk about failed experiments, Doug, I need you to go back and think about the failed experiment of telling people to stay home and cook cheesecake and stop exercising during your lockdowns. And if you're actually in the business now of cleaning up some messes, forget about me. I'll be fine. Get to me last. I'd like you to find out what happened to Dr. Patrick Phillips,
Mhm.
what happened to Dr. Roisin Killian, what happened to Dr. Mary O'Connor, Dr. Chris Shoemaker, and you're going to start cleaning up some messes.
Yeah.
We're all for it. Other than that, again, I see the picture of a politician somewhat dressed up as a clown, running around looking for a parade that they can get away with running in front of it and look like they're a leader as opposed to being a leader. But I'd really love to see a reform on those issues. Okay,
Well,
that's it. Is that okay? That's my rant. Can you add something in there just to give one
well,
last?
I've been told by people who lived in Toronto, for the last 50, 60 years, is that the drug dealers that they went to get drugs in Toronto was the Ford brothers. So, pretty
Yeah,
curious little world they live in.
I've heard some very interesting stories.
Yeah.
Those are hearsay, but just sharing what we heard, folks. Ted, I added one more thing. It's going to be a
Hmm.
brief item, although it's a huge item. And this is the former president of the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors
Uh,
Association has just said that 30 to 40% of the corpses coming in these days contain the white fibrous clots, the calamari clots. And it was interesting, Ted. I just saw this today as we're recording this, and this came out from my good friend Nick Hulsher on the Focal Points, and I'll share a link to that. And serendipitously, this is coming right after immediately after we published the first of a three-part trilogy I'm putting out on the very subject of the calamari clots, explaining what we now know from the science labs of what they are. And as well, I'm going to make sure I share that and some related material about this. Ted, going back, the NCI embalmer
right.
testimony. We held a panel. The NCI had a roundtable panel. I got to host it with the embalmers. This is all very real. And so thanks to Nick Hulsher and the former president of the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association for being honest. 30-40% of the dead bodies in
Wow.
Pennsylvania have those white rubbery things that didn't exist filling people's arteries until the safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine.
Mark, it's a shock to me, and not surprising, but still a shock that it's taken this long for this information to come out and be public. Because those embalmers knew this, you know, 4 years ago, right?
Yeah, well, we got some real great heroic Canadian bombers, among others, and we'll share links, folks. So for the paid subscribers, and you get all the itemized links and to leads to everything we talk about in the wins, please have a look at that. And a reminder too, to folks who enjoy the wins of the week every week, we've got actually across many platforms, many thousands of you. Whatever you're doing, great, and thank you. But if you happen to be in a position to choose a paid subscription, we'd really appreciate that because about 800 of us finance getting this messages to about 30 to 40,000 people. So
Mm,
thanks for helping with that. And you get to participate in the comments and tell us what you think of things.
double
Well, Ted, that
bonus.
brings us to the legal wins department. What have we got in the legal winning this week?
Well, interesting. When in the States, a federal appeals court ruled this week that a class action lawsuit against United Airlines can proceed. This is around the airline's failure to honor religious exemptions for the COVID-19 vaccine. So the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the lower court ruling that claimed that United Airlines discriminated against its employees by placing them on unpaid leave after granting them a religious exemption. And the lawsuit involves 2,221 employees. It's described as one of the most predominant private sector challenges to a corporate vaccine mandate to reach this stage of the court system. And they say a judgment in favor of the workers could encourage similar suits against other large employers that relied on unpaid leave as a way to enforce their COVID mandates and their tyranny. According to the Tampa Free Press, the court's ruling sets the stage for a high stakes trial focused on the airline's treatment of religious objectors. That should be very interesting, Mark.
Yeah, that certainly will. And seeing this happening in the US, it reminds me again, always thinking, what are we going to do on the north half of Turtle Island? It
Mm.
reminds me that we should follow this well-established practice that when we establish some legitimate government here, which I think we will sooner or later, I think this independent judiciary is a very good idea because without it, you have no checks and balances.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in Canada, Ted. For the most part, people dressed up with wigs and black robes, rubber stamping the crimes of the government and pretending that that's legitimate law or legitimate
Yeah.
courts, which it isn't. But it's good to see it alive and well in the United States. And again, as Reiner said, it's going to be the biggest pile of class action lawsuits in the history of the world.
Absolutely.
Still in the legal wins department, the government in Australia is set to pay, oh wow, talk about continuing the theme, set to pay well over $100 million to Victorian businesses to settle a class action lawsuit brought over the state's draconian lockdown policies. The government agreed to pay the plaintiffs $125 million to settle the case just days before the case was set to go to
Mm.
trial. Some 16,500 Victorian businesses joined in on this class action, started in 2020, claiming the government was responsible for economic devastation caused by the lockdown policies. And the settlement means the key figures in the then Andrews government will not have to testify in front of an open court. Opposition leader Jess Wilson said the settlement shows the lengths the state government will go to prevent Victorians knowing the truth. And to quote, we're not going to see former ministers, health ministers, public servants on the stand under oath answering questions about why they made these decisions. Sad how they change hands on the glove. So you're still fighting with the glove, but there's a new hand inside it. As a result, Australians may never know if the decisions made by the Andrews government were related to health advice or were even legal. Ted, what are your thoughts on this situation in Australia?
Well, one is I'm delighted to see that there's a settlement to compensate the Victorian businesses that were devastated by the lockdown policies. My issue with this is it says the government will pay the $125 million. The government has no money. The money they have is what they steal from citizens. And so this should rightly say the citizens will pay businesses that were devastated $125 million. The other thing is that as this opposition leader indicates, you got to know that the government does not want to be in a court of law where they have to justify their actions because they were firing blanks. They were lying to us. And so right up at the last minute, they claim they have an argument. They probably dragged this out for years. What did it say? Started in 2020. And in the last minute, when they have to produce their evidence, they back down and then put a big bill onto the citizens of the country. But the good news is that it is an acknowledgement that they wouldn't have paid the money if they thought they had an argument, and they don't have an argument. The other thing, Mark, I just want to say how ironic it is that this decision comes out at the same week that almost an identical case is here in Canada, except instead of 16,500 businessmen, it was one businessman, Adam Skelly, who was taking the government to court around there, locking down his barbecue business. And our courts here in this country somehow came to the conclusion, in spite of the lack of evidence provided by the government, that the lockdowns were reasonable and not a violation of his rights and freedoms.
Ted, I'm really glad you brought that up. Just last week, I interviewed our dear friend Jody Ledgerwood and published that interview where she gives a detailed report about the case in real insider news and from being in the courtroom the whole time. And it's interesting because if you look at that interview, folks, from just 5, 6 days ago, Jody was like, we had everything. We had all the legal arguments. We had experts. We had the science. We had the evidence. And the other side brought nothing. They had nothing at all. And then she even describes how the judge seemed to be like, oh, we're really going to look at the evidence. You're not going to get away without us looking at the evidence. And so there was this whole window dressing that left Adam Skelly and Canadians and sort of feeling like, oh, good, the courts are going to do what we thought they would do. And then, of course, a few days pass, and then you get a rubber stamp. Oh, no, it was all fine. And I think that this is one of the biggest risks we face now, which is if we keep going before these courts that have proven themselves to be completely illegitimate and say, okay, we're going to participate in this. We're going to put our facts before you so your all wise known judges can consider the facts and then tell us what the truth is. We're sort of setting them up so they can tell the lie, and it's sort of stamped as the truth. And we saw this with the Emergency Measures Act. Trudeau, in my opinion, cracked down violently in a criminal way, a complete abuse of rights, abused the emergency, used to be called War Measures Act, to do the things he did to Canadians, to seize assets, put people in jail. We saw Tamara Leach in shackles like she was Hannibal the Cannibal or something. But there's a process in Canadian law that there has to be a hearing if a prime minister ever invokes the Emergency Measures Act. So they had a hearing, 7 days of it. And for 7 days of it, those of us who were tuned in saw one piece of evidence after another. It was just a constant stream of evidence that showed it was by no means justified. It was a complete abuse. It was based on lies. It was based on fraud. But what happened at the end of the week? At the end of the week, that guy with the black suit and the funny wig came out on his make-believe ship, and he said, we have concluded with our incredible minds after looking at the evidence that the Trudeau government was justified, and he hit the mallet. So here's the problem now, is all kinds of people, that don't follow the story very closely. If you go and say, hey, do you know that what they did to the truckers was wrong? And they say, oh no, it went to court. The court looked at everything and it was okay. Oh no, it went to court and the court looked at everything. And Adam Scully was wrong. The government did the right thing. And that's my concern, especially in Canada, is we need to take away the microphone. And I don't know exactly how from these people. But anyways, beautiful to see in Australia. It looks like
Yeah.
there's some legitimacy, even though, as you said, Ted, they're making the people pay for the abuses of the people. If I could whisper one thing in the ear of the Australian Truth and Freedom movement, I'm sure you've thought of it, is the people who did those crimes while they were in government, they're liable for the crimes.
Mhm.
So don't forget who they were and continue your work to prosecute them. Maybe you're going to be lucky in Australia, like in the United States. Your old courts are going to work and the crimes will be prosecuted. If not, maybe like in Canada, maybe it's going to be the new courts that have to do that. But still, it's great to see a step in the right direction, eh, Ted?
Yeah. Yeah. Good to see. Much better to have it than not have it. So let's celebrate it.
Yeah. What else have you got for us, Ted?
Well, talk about holding people to account. So this story is about, I think we've talked about him before, Sabah Vizi. He's the Hungarian Canadian trucker from Windsor who was viciously arrested and beaten at the Freedom Convoy in 2022. I think many of us saw the video footage of that. During his violent arrest, his wrist was broken by the police. He was kneed and attacked by multiple police officers. He was urinating blood for 3 weeks and damage to his vertebrae in his neck. He suffers chronic pain, diminished use of his hand to this day. He was charged with 4 criminal charges and spent 4 years being prosecuted by the tyrants. And in November of 2025, after a grueling trial, he was declared not guilty on all accounts. The judge ruled that his charter rights were violated. So, Mark, here's an example, one of very few in Canada where a judge made the right decision and defended this individual's charter rights, and also said that the arrest and search warrant were unlawful. So, Sabah has now launched a lawsuit against the RCMP, the OPP, the Ottawa Police Services, and more. And the police officer who is seen in the video aggressively kneeing Sabah has been identified and he has been named directly in the claim. There's 2 other officers that remain unidentified, and if anybody can help identify those officers, I'm sure that would be appreciated so that there can be some accountability here, Mark.
Wow, that's a beautiful action. Kind of summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about. That's great to see. Let's hope that moves forward. And we got some more interesting news from Canada. This one comes from lawyers with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, the JCCF. Folks, if you're not aware of them, they're a great organization to support. Anyways, lawyers from the JCCF are appearing in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia on behalf of Jeffrey Evely, who's challenging the province's ban on entering wooded areas. I'll give you background on that. On August 5th, 2025, Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston banned all citizens from entering wooded areas for any purpose as part of his government's wildfire management plan. But in the case of Nova Scotia, 75% of the province is classified as wooded areas. So effectively, he was banning people's freedom of movement for most of the province. Anyways, on August 8th, Jeffrey Evely, who is a Canadian Armed Forces veteran who served Canada in 2 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, he stepped into the woods near Cox Reef, Nova Scotia, and conservation officers promptly issued him a ticket for $28,872.50. I wonder how they calculated that amount, eh? So, what Jeffrey and the JCCF lawyers are fighting is government abuse of power. And for Jeffrey, this case is personal. He said this: I believe that it's important to have the Woods Ban proclamation reviewed in light of our charter rights because I served in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I know how hard fought these freedoms really are, especially once they are lost. I find the cavalier attitude with which these freedoms have been impaired to be a gross indignity to our fellow soldiers and a moral injury to those of us who are still here. Well said, Jeffrey
Yeah,
Evelyn.
yeah. Yeah, this man is a hero in my view. He very consciously and intentionally stepped into the woods. He said he would. because he was not going to allow this violation of our rights and freedoms to be violated. Conservation officers promptly issued him a ticket. I don't know what they're conserving. They're certainly not conserving our rights and freedoms. Anyways, kudos to the JCCF. They've appealed this all the way to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. Jeff Everly was a speaker at the We Unify conference in Calgary just a few months ago that I was there as well. I've also spent some time with Jeffrey, and I think he's an example, Mark, of what all of us need to do is that we need to stand up, we need to challenge, we need not to comply. And we may get hammered like this with a $28,000 fine, but you persist because any silence or any compliance allows the tyranny to continue.
Yeah, that's so true, Ted. And for folks who are interested, I'll make sure we put some related material in the Substack, drtrozy.news, for this Wednesday of the week. If you're interested in the issue of forest fires, because forest fires have been a very interesting thing used to corral the population over the last few years. And as usual, all is not as it appears on the dinosaur media. And so we'll share a few interesting interviews and things about that with
Yeah.
today's news. Well, what have we got coming out of New York and their vaccine mandates?
Well, this is another example of people being warriors and refusing to be silenced or back down. So it's taken 3 years of legal battling before this individual, Jimmy Wagner, he's an attorney, was able to receive unredacted internal emails. He's been filing basically freedom of information requests to the city of New York, and his goal was to show how city officials and government lawyers were working together behind the scenes to violate people's rights and freedoms, to refuse religious exemptions, to dismiss workers' beliefs, and just to continue the tyranny. And so back in 2021, he started filing freedom of information requests, and the government would provide those documents, but he says they were heavily redacted, and in some cases, everything on the page except to and from. So to whoever it was to and who it was from, everything else was redacted. And so he has been battling various levels of government. And finally, he got to a level of government that said, nope, he's entitled to having unredacted emails. These are legitimate requests. And so 3 weeks ago, he was delivered all of these unredacted emails. And I'm willing to bet there's a gold mine of information there that's going to lead to some legal action. The city of New York wouldn't have fought this hard if there wasn't some pretty damning evidence there, Mark.
Yeah, that's going to be very exciting. That's going to be kind of the New York's version of the Epstein files, I
Uh,
imagine.
yeah.
Well, Ted, we got some wins in the citizen action department, one in particular. And last week we were talking about the NHPPA petition. So, anyways, the NHP is now thrilled to announce that the 157,057 signed petitions have been counted and confirmed with the clerk of petitions. And they were tabled on March 12th in the House of Commons by MP Blaine Calkins. And they note that March 12th will now forever be known as the Charter of Health Freedom Day. March 12th, Charter of Health Freedom Day. And it will go down in the history books not only as the starting point of the true health freedom Canadians, but as the third largest paper petition ever to be submitted to this old Canadian corporations parliament in its history. This petition calls upon the government to enact the Charter of Health Freedom. Because of the size of the petition, the government will be obligated to give an official response. So a lot of people, I mean, that's 150,000 people signed a petition
Yeah.
asking the government to get their foot off our access to natural products and health supplements. Ted, you've been pretty close to this situation.
Yeah,
Uh,
this is a great initiative. It's led by Sean Buckley and Teresa Buckley, but it really required the efforts of hundreds, if not thousands, of citizens right across the country who went door to door, were in various stores like Nature's Fair where I am. They would have petitions there. And it's quite a job to collect that many signatures, and they did. And so congratulations to everybody. Again, we'll see what kind of a government we have and whether they actually respond to the wishes of the people or whether they're going to be ignored. But the wishes of citizens of Canada to have access to natural health products has been delivered, and now we'll see the response.
I got to admit, my optimism is cautious
Yeah,
because the actions to liberate the rate at which drug companies can inject toxins into the population in the form of agile licensing, combined with really, Ted, the way this all started, it was very underhanded. It was sort of written into another bill where if you
yeah,
looked, you say, hey, wait a minute, just they've removed a few lines here, but when you look at what that means, it means that at the same time as they're saying, hey, new genetic experiments, and you
yeah,
know, they're not going to have to go through rigorous pharmaceutical, testing, but your vitamins are, your echinacea and your ginseng are. So they were
yeah,
very underhanded in how they loaded this thing out. So I suspect they'll be very underhanded in how they deal with it. Having said that, I'm certainly impressed with the NHPPA and 157,000 petitions. And if nothing else, we know where we stand on this, folks. I don't think any of you should give up the natural products that are keeping you and your family healthy because some lunatic tells you to. I think it just gets more and more like living in under an oppressive regime during
yeah,
these
yeah,
times and making
yeah,
sure, I've been in meetings with companies that are interested in creating solutions, and multiple companies have said, no, not worth going into Canada. That's just the government there, or the old world government is just too severe, and it makes it very hard to help people with natural
yeah,
things that actually help people.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Ted, we're into your favorite section, the truth bombs, telling it like
Yeah.
it is. What great truth tellers do we have this week?
Well, we talked about this individual last week, I think. He's former CBC host Travis Duranja. He was presenting to a parliamentary committee that allowed him to name names. And so I know that I've been looking forward to this. So he alleged this week that he's removed from his program after raising concerns about bias at the CBC. He told the committee that he was taken off the air and eventually forced out after challenging what he described as centralized editorial control and a lack of viewpoint diversity within the network. I think that means censorship. He has since filed a human rights complaint alleging discrimination and retaliation, seeking damages and calling for an investigation into the CBC workplace policies. During his testimony, he also claimed that political booking decisions were tightly controlled and that conservative voices were blocked from appearing on certain programs. CBC, of course, rejected the allegations, saying the claims include misleading statements and false accusations, and noted that its formal response has been submitted to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Yeah, I don't believe a word the CBC says.
Well, obviously, you've been paying attention. Safe and effective. Uh, so it's interesting, he comments that conservative voices were blocked. And of course, there's a difference between conservative voices and conservative politicians, or politicians who are labeled as conservative. So I just have to take a moment to for us to recognize Derek Sloan at this time, because Derek Sloan was a member of the Conservative Party. He was an elected member of Parliament with the Conservative Party. He tried to do the conservative thing in terms of respecting people's freedom and wanting to have open debate. In 2020, had greats like Patrick Phillips, Byron Bridle show up at the Parliament, and he was thrown out of the Conservative Party by the Conservative Party leadership. And I don't say that to drive people to another variation of the WEF in Canada, right? Just to point out that the in many ways the CBC didn't have to reject conservative voices because the Conservative Party did it for them. But anyways, I still think this is a super important testimony, and I'm going to make sure we find a link and get as much so people can look at this, because there's still some people out there who can't believe that the dinosaur media is lying and leading sheep to slaughter. And it's hard for these people to realize what's going on, but it's really important, because as long as you follow the piper, you're going to go where he's taking you. And he's so far done a terrible job of taking people in the wrong direction.
Well, Mark, I read an article this week that purportedly brought forward data from the CBC's annual report. And in it, it claimed that, do you know what percentage of the Canadian population watch the CBC or listen to the CBC? Let me see how good your assessment is of the situation.
Well, I'd be afraid it's something crazy like 70%. And at the same time, I hope it's something small like 30.
Would you believe 1.7%?
1.7% of Canadians are still listening to the dinosaur CBC. Wow. And yet everybody's being taxed to finance this glut.
Yeah, what was it, 1.2 or 1.4 billion dollars?
Wow.
And this same article talked about what could be purchased with 1.4 billion dollars. And I think it said something like, if I remember correctly, Mark, 6,000 police officers and 6,000 doctors could be hired instead of the CBC. I think I'd rather have the police officers and the doctors.
Oh yeah, me too, especially if you get some honest ones.
Yeah.
And Ted, you can't undersize for me. I can't understate the danger of the CBC. Like how
Mm.
dangerous is this thing? And not them alone. Everybody that got on the media bailout and sucked up millions and millions, and I think it pushed $1 billion in the end, and it's still going of
Yeah.
tax dollars. But in 2020, when I would come into my hospital where I'd been walking into for many years to start my day, and there was the guard waiting there to make sure we all wore masks and the empty waiting room of COVID. But the CBC was playing all the time. So that 1.7% of Canadians, unfortunately, almost everybody who finds himself in a waiting room in a hospital sits there getting the worst information they get from the most, dishonest propagandist, in my opinion, in
Yeah.
Canadian history. So, but I'm glad to hear that we're down to 1.7%. And as for Travis Don Raj, hey, the alternative media is looking for you, which is now the real media. And I hope that you take an active role in educating the public and truth telling like a real journalist should.
Yeah, good
Well,
story.
Ted, we got something here from something very close to your heart we spoke about last week, which is the recent NCI hearings in Kelowna. And John Graff, who not only is a farmer and really quite a thinker, very educated on subjects like animal nutrition and husbandry, farming, technology, biofuels, so many things. And he was also the last to testify. And I've watched that. Folks, if you haven't seen that, you don't have to wait for the NCI to have it all broken down into parts. You can just go to the hearings from Kelowna at the National Citizen Inquiry.ca and go at the end, and you'll see John Graff testifying. And, after a little bit of light joking around and just, being the humble guy that he is, he dives into the material and
Mm.
it's quite shocking. So Connie Shields, telling it like it is, wrote this inspired by what John Graff had presented. She said, agriculture is increasingly governed not by farmers, but by systems designed far away from the land. Most Canadians rarely think about where their food comes from. We walk into a grocery store and assume that the shelves will always be full. Farmers know better. They understand how fragile the system actually is. Weather matters, feed matters, disease policies matter, and increasingly regulatory decisions made in offices hundreds or thousands of miles away matter most of all. And when those decisions are based on precaution alone, and I think she's being kind,
Yeah.
without proportionality or local knowledge, entire herds of flocks can disappear
Mm.
overnight, and the public rarely sees those moments, but the farmers do. This
Yeah.
is, I mean, this is important, Ted, and nobody more qualified to comment on the tail end of that than you.
Yeah, I thought John Graff's testimony at the NCI was the most powerful of the 3 days. And this Substack article that Connie Shields wrote about John Graff's testimony, the title of it was John Graff, You Had Me at I Do. And the I do is, is following the oath. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And she really honors John as he needs to be honored. But John mapped out the plan to remove natural proteins from our food supply and then replace them with lab grown and artificially pharmaceutically created proteins. And you'd like to think this is science fiction or out of the Twilight Zone, but he actually shares the documents that shows you the progression of that agenda through legislation, through contracts, through the development of corporations, and through production. And it's not a twilight, well, it is a twilight zone, but it's not a fantasy, it's a reality. And that was probably the testimony that alerted me at how serious is the threat to our access to food and healthy food in this country. We take for granted Canada should be, and it has been, one of the wealthiest nations in the world in terms of food production, but there are reasons to be concerned about it in the very near future.
Yeah. And, Ted, one of the things that stood out in John's testimony to me was the old corporation of Canada, etc., actively identifying and creating mass burial sites
Yeah.
for livestock. And John goes through the dimensions. I mean, it's not his dimensions, it's their dimensions. Goes through dimensions, and you start to realize, like, wow, they're literally building places for hundreds of thousands or millions of cattle. And
Yeah.
folks, that's that hamburger you feed your kid. That's
Well,
that the steak dinner. That's the milk. It's all the cheese, all of it.
and I think the next step of that agenda, Mark, is that there are many of us that after John spoke said, are those pits really for cattle or are they for us? And you might think that that's a stretch, but you look at what other tyrannical governments have done in the last 100 years, they have killed millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in their tyrannical quest for full control. And I have no illusion that Canada will be exempt from that kind of tyranny if we allow it to continue the path that it's on.
Yeah, Ted, history really supports what you're saying. And, it's been on my mind lately, the Russian so-called revolution.
Yeah,
And if you underestimate the sort of ideologues or the communists, the Marxists, whatever you want to call them, they keep changing. But the people we're looking at, them, the WEF, the UN, them. These authoritarian people abusing, administrative offices to poison the society and all the things that we're talking about. If you want to see that
yeah,
acted out on real full scale, it
yeah,
was done very well at that time. And starvation of the people was a major focal point. They would
yeah.
literally come and say, listen, we're taking all the food. People say, but we'll be starving in a few days. Yeah, we know. And then, from there they went into a processing factory, I believe is the greatest killing of humans in the history of the world. And, it was only a few years before that they had a pretty legitimate government. They had a
Yep.
good czar. It was a great place to live. And the people who ran that, pretending they were on base some kind of ideological mission, they hated the Russians. They slaughtered them by the millions. So it's certainly worth considering, what are those big holes in the farm fields for, if not to starve us?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and John began his presentation with Kissinger's quote that says, he who controls the food controls the people. And then another quote that calls most of humanity a useless eater. So that's the consciousness of this tyrannical corporation that is imposing these kinds of measures.
Yeah, that is what we're up against. Well,
Not even,
what have you got here, Ted? Dr. Gator. I like the name just off the start.
yeah. So he commented on the situation in the States. I would assume many on this call are aware of a judge who made a ruling this week that paused the U.S. Childhood vaccine policy that was implemented recently by Secretary Kennedy, and also the appointment of the members that he made to the ACIP. And so somehow a judge gets to decide that, oh no, you didn't appoint the right people and you don't have the authority to change the vaccine schedule. So it's really put a pause on things. I can't imagine that decision by this Biden appointed judge is going to carry the day. But this is what Dr. Gator said. He said, this starts to look a lot like judicial activism and overreach. The structure here is not complicated. The Secretary of Health and Human Services appoints members to the ACIP. ACIP reviews evidence and makes recommendations to the CDC. That's the process that has existed for decades. People can absolutely disagree with who was chosen or what recommendations came out of that committee, but disagreement does not make the process illegal. What this ruling essentially says is, we don't like the people you appointed, so we're going to stop the committee entirely. That's a dangerous precedent. Because if courts begin stepping in simply because one dislikes the composition of an advisory panel, then the other side will do exactly the same thing the next time the political winds shift. Every committee, every recommendation, every policy decision becomes another lawsuit waiting to happen. That's not governance, that's paralysis. And honestly, watching it unfold feels less like serious public health policy and more like a sad political joke, which is the last thing we need. The entire process starts to feel less like governance and more like political theater. Boy, I think that's a pretty good truth bomb from Dr. Gator.
Yeah, I think it is. And it seems to me there's like there's a macro and a micro interpretation of the core advice here, for instance, to this judge is like, wait, you're supposed to follow a process. You're supposed to enforce the law, not use your position to impose. I'm guessing that the judge is just another propagandized fool who believes that everyone in the world was dying of infectious diseases and as they added vaccines, that's how we got to be so healthy. You know, that's how we got 1 in 30 kids to have autism, for instance, right? So I'm assuming this judge is misinformed, but still he's using his power outside of what it's been given to
Yeah,
him. It's like a
he's
policeman's
exceeding.
given a gun to
Mhm.
enforce the law, not to shoot somebody that pisses him off.
Yeah,
And that's what this guy's doing. But when I say, what can we also take from our own self? I think, working in the organizations that we do across the truth and freedom movement is, like you've said before, Ted, disagree but don't divide, is that there are processes. And sometimes as a group, we have to learn to make a decision. It may not resonate 100% with me. Now, if it's a corrupt decision, it's going to kill people, well, then obviously I wouldn't be part of it. But I think what this judge needs to learn is something we all need to learn, which is to work together and to respect the process if the process is legitimate.
yeah.
Well, here's some more telling it like it is. Rod Taylor, who's the national leader of the Christian Heritage Party of Canada, he had to say this in response to the Ontario Court of Appeal's decision to deny the Christian Heritage Party from purchasing advertising space on bus shelters in Hamilton, Ontario. Hmm. They're specifically not allowed to purchase advertising space. It's probably because they're advertising drugs. Oh no, that was the government. Sorry. Let's see what it's all about. It's funny, like in a state where the government's like, come on in and get some free crack and we'll kill your kids in the emergency department. But the Christian Heritage Party, well, you're not allowed to advertise. Well, let's find out what terrible things they were going to say. Anyways, carrying on with what Rod Taylor said about this, about the court saying, yeah, you can't use billboards, basically. The message, by the way, that they wanted to put in billboard was this. It said, woman, an adult female. That's it. That's all they wanted to say is woman, an adult female. So Rod's saying today free speech has been given a black eye by judges who neglected to recognize our constitutional rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. All of these freedoms are listed in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and are part of our great Canadian heritage, our Christian heritage. Yet we see today that political correctness and woke ideology have infected not only our legislatures, but also our courts. Ted, an adult male, what do you think about this?
I want to write to Rod and say, Rod, I think you should apply again to the city of Hamilton to put a billboard on a bus shelter. And this time you say, woman, whatever you think a woman is, and see whether they grant you the ability to have that billboard. I just think let's expose them for who they are, because I'm sure they would allow that to happen.
What have we got from the democracy front, Ted?
Well, they had a message this week where they said recent media reports indicate that many Canadian universities engage in targeted discriminatory practices that restrict eligibility based on race, sexuality, and gender. The policies are based on the false premise that past discrimination can be remedied by present discrimination. These policies are immoral and corrosive to civil society. In a multicultural society such as Canada, they racially divide and antagonize people, incentivize them to identify tribally, and encourage sectarianism. The federal and provincial government should reverse these policies and prioritize merit-based hiring. Yeah, that's a pretty good truth bomb from the Democracy Fund.
Yeah, that is a good one. And, we can reach out to bridge builders over this one, Ted. I'm having a bit of a fun mood today. I hope you don't mind. It is Wins of the Week after all. But we're a little concerned that the people hired by the government and other institutions to design our bridges might not be qualified based on their merit as engineers, but they might be qualified under diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I am begging our top bridge engineers in the region north of the United States to put on a dress and see if you can get these jobs so that we have some smart people deciding how the bridges are built before they all collapse. What do you think, Ted? Is that a good plan?
Oh, we need something. I was in a meeting this week, Mark, with Dr. Jennifer Hibbert. You know Dr. Hibbert
Oh,
well.
very well. She's a hero.
She was telling us that she teaches at University of Toronto at the School of Dentistry. She's a doctor of dentistry. She's a dental surgeon, actually. And she was telling us in that meeting that they have DEI criteria for enrollment in the dental school. And so it's got nothing to do with merit. And the other thing she said is that they're no longer allowed to fail a student. So if anybody simply
Pardon
shows
me?
up, yeah, they're allowed to pass regardless of how well they do or how much they show up in class. She said that's now the standard at the University of Toronto. How do you like that one?
That's scary. I mean, what if somebody needs dental work
Mm.
and they go get a dentist who can't fail dental school no matter what they do? And to boot, they might have gotten that position not because of their skills, but maybe because of their red high heels, size 14. I don't know.
Yeah, a little alarming, but
Yeah, it sure is.
maybe it has to get this bad before somebody figures out that you need to prioritize merit, as the Democracy Fund says.
Yeah. And there is a free market underlying things still happening. There is an influence of freedom and intelligent people, and a lot of people are intelligent. Like you just pointed out. I mean, what did we find out? 52% of Americans believe the COVID shot's poison. So, and as you just pointed out, the CBC, 1.7% of people actually watch it.
Yeah,
So even though the politicians are hiding behind their propagandists and thinking that we're all believing them because CBC is saying so, guess what? Most of us aren't. And the emperor wears no clothes.
mhm.
And we're starting to point that out. Schools like the University of Toronto Dental School, by doing what they're doing, they're torching their credibility
Yeah,
among intelligent people. It's going to become a situation where a graduate of the University of Toronto Dental School applies for a job in Texas. And Texas goes, "What dental school did you graduate from?" And they say, "The University of Toronto." And they go, "Oh, yeah, okay. You couldn't fail. And even if you've got pretty pictures of yourself looking like a leprechaun, we're not interested." And people are going to make those choices too. People are going to choose to go like,
yeah,
"I don't want to see a University of Toronto grad. That's crazy.
yeah.
I'm going to go down to Texas and get some guy with a big hat. I don't care how he dresses. He's got to know what he's doing." So I think just exposing all this is a win, Ted.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I love these truth bombs. That
Yeah.
shine a
What else?
big light on them.
Yeah. What's the next truth bomb?
Well, this is a book that's been put out just this week by Jan Jelic with Epoch Times. It's called Killed to Order, and it's about the whole industry of organ harvesting that happens in China. Dr. Joseph Varon wrote the foreword to the book. This is what he said in the foreword. He said, "Physicians need to remember why consent matters and why life cannot be reduced to parts. Medicine exists to serve the human person, not the state, not ideology, not efficiency, and not power. When it forgets that, it becomes something else entirely." And then Jelinek states China was practicing utilitarian medicine where some are sacrificed for betterment of the whole, not Hippocratic medicine where the person is at the core of medicine. I just thought, one is it's a very dark book, but it needs to be exposed. But two, I thought those are pretty good truth bombs there.
Yeah. Yeah. And Ted, my doctor medicine cap can't help but pop in just on the subject of organ transplants these days. And of course, forcibly taking people's organs like cattle, like they do
Yeah.
places like China. Although you'd be amazed what they do with the whole program in Canada. I mean, they got a different coercive way of doing it.
Well,
Um,
it's one of the extensions of the MAID program, Mark.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But folks, if for any reason you're going to get an organ transplanted in your body, or if for any reason you're going to give somebody an organ that you love, I would highly recommend organs that come out of people who've not been injected with genetic vaccines. And I could show you a lot of reasons for that, but you can just look up the word autopsy on the site and have a look for yourself. Well, here's another truth bomb. This one's from Martin Armstrong of Armstrong Economics, and he wrote this: Alberta's separation is inevitable given the global trend that is becoming highly influential. I have warned that the corruption within government is always what brings down governments for thousands of years. Once a centralized government seizes power, it cannot resist exercising more and more power. This will always lead to corruption in Republican forms of government, ultimately bribing people in office to do as they desire. Centralized governments inevitably lead toward core Marxism, for that never benefits the people but yields more power for the state. This always leads to the idea that the government can control society. Taxation and regulation rise, and this becomes the seed of corruption. All nations collapse and break apart because centralized government is always inefficient. It is inevitable that a centralized government that thinks it is in charge becomes increasingly authoritarian and always seeks more power when a crisis arises, claiming it could have prevented the event if it just had a little more power. Well spoken, Martin Armstrong. Ted, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, he starts off with Alberta separate, and here's why, because this totalitarianism always goes to hell.
Well, I concur with his assessment. I think that we're witnessing the destruction of Canadian society, and I don't see how it can be reversed unless it really takes a strong and courageous leader who says we have to reduce the amount of power that the central government has. We have to reduce the amount of taxation. We have to reduce the size of the bureaucracy if we're going to save this country. I've come to realize that our governments are like a cancer that is growing out of control. And at some point, it takes over the body and kills it. And I think
Yeah.
that's what we're witnessing. And I don't have a whole lot of hope that there's a leader out there that's strong enough or wise enough to make the kind of decisions that have to be made to save Canada. So I too think Alberta separation and actually separation of all the provinces is the inevitable outcome. Whether that will happen in the next 2 years or 5 years or generation or not, I think we're on a one-way path here unless there is some very enlightened and wise souls that begin to take charge of the ship here and do a U-turn.
Yeah. Yeah, and Ted, this, when I think of centralized government, well, what's the opposite? What's the opposite of bigger government? It's local governance.
Yeah.
It's people running their lives, running their homes, neighborhoods running their neighborhoods, towns running their towns. And there's this growing idea that needs to ungrow, which is that, for instance, if it's a federal government, well, that's the big one with all the power. No, that's like your community neighborhood association. If you have a neighborhood association, are they in charge of what happens in your house? No, you are. And I think that at the same time as we need to reduce the power of centralizing structures, which really should just be agreements. Like Bruce Parody said, if you're going to establish good government, like a good Alberta, you need very limited power of government
Yeah.
because you want the power of people's lives to be in their own hands. That's the whole movement of freedom. So I think that what Merton is saying is completely true. You know, Centralized, expanded governments collapse into corruption. And what we need to build is local governments. And local governance really starts with governing your own self, governing your own
Right.
mind, and standing, doing what is right. We're in tricky times, but we need to really choose what we navigate by.
Yeah. Well,
Well, we
this,
got another great truth bomb, Ted. Can you tell us about this one?
yeah, this is the last one we've got today, and this comes from Juno News. They've been threatened with legal action by a trans-identified sex worker who is running to become the mayor of Hamilton, Ontario. So Hamilton is the same city. They wouldn't allow that billboard, so go figure.
Yeah.
Anyways, Juno News is being sued by this sex worker for misgendering him in their reporting. Juno News wrote the following response, and it goes like this. It says, Scarlett slash Jelena, I'm not sure what to call you because you use multiple names online. Thanks for the email. It is our editorial policy to tell the truth. We refuse to be bullied into submission based on woke ideological pressures. Men are not women. Men cannot become women. The CBC and some government agencies may happily go along with the delusion, but Juno News will not. We will continue to accurately report to our audiences the differences between men and women. To be perfectly honest, you seem like a nice person and someone who's had a difficult life. We're not trying to be mean to you. We are simply being honest with you. We wish you well. Best wishes, Candace, Editor-in-Chief, Juneau News.
Wow, Ted, I just realized I'm typing a little in the background here because I've got to find Juno News. Sounds like a news organization worth following, someone who's going to try to tell me the truth on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I like the way I like the way they finish it up too, Ted.
Mm,
And it reminds me of something by another famous leader in society that I quote usually at least once a week. Jesus Christ said, "Love the sinner, hate the sin."
mm,
And you can see they're saying, "Okay, we disagree with you about something." So there's the sin. There's the thing we don't think is good, but we still love you.
mm,
And I think that's a beautiful, they've really drawn the line very well.
yeah.
I wish everybody would enter into even legal matters with that degree of purity and honesty.
Mm. Yeah, it's a nice, I like their response.
Well, that's kind of brings us to the end of the list for the week. We do have some inspirational words of wisdom,
Mm,
and these come from the poet Rumi. And it is this, it's very short. Wherever love goes and resides, all that is impossible becomes possible.
yeah.
Oh, just makes you want to take a moment and meditate and just
Mm,
like emote love.
mhm. Yeah, I that came across my desk this week, and I just thought we need to be reminded of those fundamentals. And we're in an impossible situation, and the way out of this is, to me, is through love, not through fear, not through anger. Maybe that follows nicely with the last message from Juneau News that in spite of their differences with this gentleman, they act in a loving way.
Yeah, that's right. And of course it doesn't mean that, love coexists with wisdom.
Mm.
And so for instance, love isn't like pulling your shirt open and saying to the vampires, "Oh, you need blood, go ahead, take blood." That's not love, that's foolishness. But I do like this. Wherever there is love, everything is possible. Well, there's lots of love in you, Ted.
Hmm.
I bet you wherever you go this week, there's going to be all kinds of possible things
Yeah.
happening, all kinds of good things happening as always. And our listeners too. Carry that light of love everywhere you go. You are the light of the world. Let it
Mm.
shine. Ted, speaking of beautiful lights that shone in this world,
Mm.
I hope you can talk about this, but a beautiful, amazing musician, a very spiritual person who I did not get to know, but you got to know very well. Denise Hagen has left this
Mm.
world after an illness. So Ted put forward 100% my support that the song of the week, the outro song this week, should be a song called Perfect Replications, which is
Mm.
by Denise Hagen. And folks, I was blown away by how beautiful this song is. Don't miss this one. It's short, it's sweet, it's uplifting. But Ted, I know you've got a lot of things to do. Can you tell us a little bit about Denise and a little bit about this collection of music and where it came from?
Yeah.
Perfect Replications.
Yeah, Denise is she was just angelic. If you go on YouTube and watch some of her videos where you get to see this beautiful soul singing, she is quite remarkable. She has the voice of an angel. And my wife came across her music, I don't know, more than 10 years ago when she was attending a spiritual conference, and we just fell in love with it. And we literally played her album every day for a year. I mean, we were just so enchanted with it. And she's from Ireland. And I reached out to her and she responded, and she always said she wanted to come to Canada. So we invited her to come and live with us. And so she lived with us for 6 months. And Denise was one of those beautiful souls, and we just fell in love with her. But she was like many, she was coerced during the COVID fiasco to take the shot. She needed to travel to spend time with her parents. Her father was ill and dying, and she wanted to be there to be a support. So she took the shot, and she did not do well with it. And she developed turbo cancer. She passed very quickly. And so she actually passed this morning. And I just thought this was a beautiful honoring of her. I wanted people to be exposed to her music. And I want to share just the story of this song that I selected off her album. As you said, it's called Perfect Replications. She tells of a time in her life when she was not doing well, when she was really struggling, and she was actually suicidal. And she said, I got on my knees and I prayed to God before I went to bed at night. Said, if you need me to stick around, you need to let me know. You need to give me a message. And she said, yeah, it brings up emotion just here remembering this. She said she woke up in the middle of the night and there was a figure standing at the end of her bed, long hair in a robe, and it was Jesus, and he was singing to her, and he sang her this song, and she immediately wrote down the words, and that's the words in the song. And it begins, "You are the perfect replications. You're the ones that I adore. I put you up beyond the veil so that you might choose the love." And it's just beautiful lyrics, a beautiful voice, and she plays most of the music on the album. So I think you'll be moved by this beautiful angel that has now left us.
Oh, indeed. Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed the wins of the week. This song is going to touch you for sure. They're tears, but they're tears of joy.
Hmm.
And Ted, thanks for everything you're doing. We're going to gather up a whole bunch more wins. We got a bunch of winning to do ourselves through the week. Folks, good luck with all your winning, getting all the things that you're getting done to help create a future for the future, for
Hmm.
future generations.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Look
See
forward
you
to
next
next week.
week. Till then.
If you could see what I see, you'd lose your breath for sure. You are the perfect replications and the ones that I adore. I carved you from a diamond and polished you with love. Then I sent you out beyond the veil so you might choose the love. Oh, my sweet creations, your beauty makes me weep. Oh, my sweet creations, the whole world's at your feet. And one day soon you'll see it. If you could see what I see, you'd never lose your smile. For you walk in thy own footsteps when you walk that second mile. These are more than words, my love. This is poetry divine. My signature is everywhere, for all of life is mine. One day you'll see what I see, and you'll come to realize that every tear you ever cried, I wiped from my own eyes. I know your every feeling, and I felt your every joy. But you and I are one, my child, still illusion was the choice. could see what I see, you'd lose your breath for sure. You are the perfect replications. You're the ones that I adore.